Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi wa kafa wa salamun ala ibadihi alladhina istafa. Sallallahu ta'ala alayhi wa ala alihi wa ashabihi wa man walaha ma ba'd. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Inshallah, in this episode, I wanted to reflect on two verses from Surah Az-Zumar, verses 36 and 37, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reminds us that He alone is sufficient for the believers, and that the help of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is sufficient for us to overcome any difficulty, to prevent anything from happening to us and from being destroyed. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reminds us, أَلَيْسَ اللَّهُ بِكَافٍ عَبَدَهُ. In verse number 36, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, is Allah not sufficient for His servant? وَيُخَوِّفُونَكَ بِالَّذِينَ مِن دُونِهِ. And the disbelievers make you fear, or they threaten you with the power of that which they worship other than Allah. And in our context, it might not necessarily be idols, but the people who have power and influence make us fear that power and influence, that they have the capacity to destroy us, to harm us at will, and that there's nothing we can do about it. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reminds us that Allah is sufficient for us, even though they make us fear. True power is Allah's, and true protection lies only in Allah. وَمَن يُضْلِلِ اللَّهُ فَمَا لَهُ مِنْ هَادٍ. And whomever Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has let go to be astray, فَمَا لَهُ مِنْ هَادٍ, there is no one that can bring them back. There is no one that can guide them. Elsewhere in the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that if a person is going astray, it is with the knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because nothing escapes the knowledge of Allah. But this is implied as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allows a person to make their own choices because of their arrogance and stubbornness and disbelief in Him. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ultimately lets them go to face the consequences. And whoever is on that path, فَمَا لَهُ مِنْ هَادٍ, there's no one that can bring them back to the right path, because the only one that can guide is Allah. وَمَنْ يَهْدِ اللَّهُ فَمَا لَهُ مِنْ مُضِلٍ. In verse number 37, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, whomever He guides, there is no one that can lead them astray, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the focal point that we have to focus on. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has put us on this path, and He is the one that keeps us on this path, and there is no one, if Allah does not will it, that can take us off this path. And Allah reminds us as a way of comforting us, أَلَيْسَ اللَّهُ بِعَزِيزٍ ذِي انْتِقَامٍ. Is Allah not the one who is mighty? Is Allah not the one who is capable of taking revenge? Is He not the one capable of exacting punishment from the disbelievers and oppressors on the Day of Judgment? Within the last year, we have seen so much atrocities. Hundreds of pictures and videos coming out of Gaza. We have seen poverty and displacement in Sudan. We have seen constant bombing in the Yemen. And we have seen atrocities happening throughout the Muslim world in the last 2 decades. At times it feels that we are very helpless. It feels like we don't have any capacity to defend ourselves, that we don't have any influence or control, and that we are simply at the mercy of people who are willing to harm us for any reason whatsoever. That we are at the mercy of those who have no faith, we are at the mercy of those who have no compassion, and we are at the mercy of those who are helped by others who also have no compassion. That our lives as believers, that our lives as people who think differently are devalued, and our personhood is dehumanized to the point where when we have thousands and hundreds of thousands of losses, there's no one that blinks an eye. Or if the people do blink an eye, those that are in capacity, those that are in power and control, do nothing to change course. It is disheartening at times, and it's very natural to feel disheartened, because as human beings, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us that capacity to feel a multitude of emotions. Yet our overpowering emotion should always be hope. أَلَيْسَ اللَّهُ بِكَافٍ عَبْدَهُ. Is Allah not sufficient for His servant? Just like how the Prophet ﷺ and the Sahaba radiallahu ta'ala anhum had firm faith on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and how in the battle of Badr, which happened during the month of Ramadan, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allowed a small group of believers who were not well equipped, who were not fully armed, to face an army who was willing to do them harm, who were fully equipped and intent on wiping out the believers. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala granted the believers victory. Alaysa Allahu bikafin abda. It is a reminder to you and I that Allah is sufficient for you and I, that there's no one that we need if we have the help of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And in order to receive the help of Allah, we have to constantly turn back to Allah. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala guide us and protect us, give us knowledge that benefits us, give us the ability to always turn back to Him, to always ask for His help, and to always be convinced of the fact that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is sufficient for us and we have no need for anyone else. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless us all. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.